Here is the rewritten story, optimized for viral YouTube storytelling. The sun wasn't just hot, it was angry. A white-hot coin melting the sky over western Montana. The land below? Parched, dry, everything was brittle and gold. The air shimmered and the dirt path twisted and danced like a mirage. And then a sound. Not the wind, not the cicadas. It was the desperate pounding of bare feet. A little girl, no older than 8, her small body pushed to its limit, ran along the path. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her dress was torn. She wasn't playing. She was running for her life. Her mother's words echoed in her head with every frantic step. Run, Abby. Run and don't look back. Find help. Up ahead, a ranch. A house, a barn, a lone figure hammering by a fence. Smoke rose from the chimney, even in this heat. George Cutter saw her coming, a frantic bird cutting across the horizon. He put his hammer down. He waited. She stumbled to a halt before him, dust and fear choking her words. They tied my mommy to the rock by the river, she cried. They said to let her learn what it feels like to be a burden. Please, she's burning. Please don't let her die. George's face remained impassive. He absorbed her words. He didn't ask a single question. Instead, he turned and strode to his horse. No saddle, no hat. He just swung himself up. Abigail tried to follow, but her small legs couldn't keep up. Without slowing, George reached down, extended his hand, and in one fluid motion, pulled her up onto the horse in front of him. The bay took off like it understood the stakes. The world blurred. They rode toward the river. By the time they reached the river bend, the sun was a white-hot eye staring down without mercy. The air felt thick, difficult to breathe. And there she was, crumpled against a large smooth stone in the shallow water. A woman in a simple dress, her skin an angry red, her hair matted with mud. Her wrists were bound with fraying rope. She wasn't crying. She was past that. George dismounted and knelt, pulling his knife from his belt. He didn't say a word. His hands, rough from ranch work, untied the knots without a single jerk. One by one, the ropes came loose. He dipped his handkerchief in the river, pressing the cool cloth to her burning forehead. Only then did she stir. She opened her eyes and she looked at him, not with gratitude, not with fear, but with a quiet question in her gaze. Why? He didn't answer. He just kept tending her wounds, his movements clinical but gentle. When he had done what he could, he lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. Abigail stood in the water uncertain. George glanced down, shifted the woman's weight, and reached for the girl's hand. Come on, he said simply. Let's get your mama somewhere cool. The walk back was slow and silent. He took them to the barn, not the house. The barn was cool and quiet, the thick walls blocking the heat. He laid her gently on a bed of hay near a window. Then, with a voice used to giving orders to animals, he spoke to the girl. Abby, he said, there's a well by the house. Can you bring a bucket of water? Abigail hurried off. While she was gone, George fetched a clean cloth and a small tin of salve. He knelt beside the woman, hesitating. Ma'am, he said quietly, I need to tend those rope burns. I'll be respectful. She managed a small nod. With careful hands, he applied the salve, his touch the hands of a man who had tended wounds before. When he finished, he moved away, giving her space. Abigail returned with the water. George gave her a cloth. You can help your mama cool down, he said. While the girl dabbed the cloth on her mother's forehead, George poured water into a tin cup. He supported the back of her neck and held the cup to her lips. She drank, choked, then drank more steadily. When the cup was empty, her voice came out as a cracked whisper. Why are you helping us? He didn't answer. He simply went to the door, returned with a faded quilt, and draped it over her. Abigail looked up at him, wide-eyed. What's your name, sir? She asked. George, he said. The single word came out rough. The girl offered a tentative smile. I'm Abigail, she said. This is my mommy. Her name's Rose. The name settled in the air like a vow. Rose. George nodded once, then turned toward the door. Rest now, he said. I'll bring some food when you're ready. He stepped outside and stood on the porch looking at his land. But his eyes saw something more than the fences and the dry earth. Something had shifted. Some invisible current had changed direction. He brought them food later: biscuits, dried peaches, cold beans. He placed it near them but didn't linger. The worst of the heat finally began to recede. Inside the barn, Rose stirred, managing to sit up with Abigail's help. She glanced toward the door where George had disappeared. She reached down to the hem of her dress. Her fingers searched for something sewn into the fabric. A small object was hidden there, a military badge, old and tarnished, stitched into a secret pocket. She touched it briefly, as if to make sure it was still there. Then she whispered to Abigail, "Remember what I told you? Don't say anything about our things. Not yet." As twilight deepened, George returned with a lantern. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better," she said. "Thank you for—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing all he had done. George accepted her thanks without comment. As he turned to go, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. "My house is just there," he said, nodding toward the door. "I'll be on the porch most of the night. If you need anything, just call." Rose watched him leave, confusion evident in her expression. When he was gone, she pulled Abigail close. "Will they come looking for us, Mama?" Abigail asked, her small voice tight with worry. "Not tonight," Rose murmured, stroking her daughter's hair. "We're safe for now." But as Abigail drifted to sleep, Rose remained awake, listening to the sounds of the unfamiliar ranch. Through the slats in the barn wall, she could see George's silhouette on the porch, a dark shadow against the night. He sat motionless, facing out toward the road, a rifle across his knees. She wondered what kind of man would risk himself for strangers. In her experience, men always wanted something. But what did this quiet rancher want? That night, thunder rolled far off, a soft warning. The air grew heavy. George lit another lantern and brought extra blankets to the barn, careful not to wake them. In the quiet, he sat outside the barn door, watching the lightning flicker along the distant hills. The woman inside was a stranger, but something about her stillness, her shame, the way she clung to breath but not hope, it stirred something in him he hadn't touched in years. He didn't sleep. When dawn came, he heard quiet movement inside, soft voices, a child's gentle laughter. He was at the well when he felt someone watching. Abigail stood a few yards away, clutching an empty tin cup. "Mama sent me to get water," she said politely. "How is she today?" George asked. "Better," Abigail replied. "She can sit up by herself now." George turned toward the house. "Wait here." He returned moments later with a tin cup of warm milk and a piece of cornbread. As Abigail turned to go, she hesitated. "The men who hurt Mama," she said quietly, "they said God wanted to punish her because she's bad luck." George crouched down to her level, his expression serious. "Your mama isn't bad luck," he said firmly, "and God doesn't tie women to rocks in the sun." Abigail considered this, then nodded, apparently satisfied. "That's what I thought too," she said, then hurried back to the barn. George watched her go, something dark passing behind his eyes. He straightened up, looking toward the road that led back to town. His jaw tightened. Then he turned and walked toward the corral where his horse waited, already planning a day's work that would keep him close to the barn. Inside, Rose was attempting to stand, her legs trembling with the effort. When Abigail returned with the milk and bread, Rose managed a smile that transformed her face despite the sunburn and exhaustion. "Look what Mr. George sent," Abigail said proudly. Rose eased herself back down onto the haybed, accepting the cup of milk. It was the first meal she had eaten in nearly 2 days. It was also a meal provided by a stranger, after her own kin had left her to die. She heard the sound of hammering outside. She made her way to the barn door, and through the gap, she could see George working on the north fence. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who had been doing such work for years. She watched him for a long moment, trying to reconcile the solitary, careful man with the one who had ridden out without hesitation to save a stranger. "He doesn't talk much," Abigail observed, coming to stand beside her mother. "No," Rose agreed. "I don't think he needs to." Throughout that day, Rose gradually reclaimed her strength. By evening, she felt steady enough to try to repay some small part of their host's kindness. She found a broom and swept the barn floor, clearing away loose hay and dust. When George returned, he paused in the doorway, taking in these small changes with a glance. If he was surprised, he didn't show it. "I brought stew," he said, holding up a pot. They ate together that evening, sitting on upturned crates in the barn doorway. George ate methodically, his eyes on the horizon. He didn't press for conversation, but when Abigail asked about the chickens, he answered with patient simplicity. "How long have you lived here, Mr. George?" Abigail asked. 15 years, he replied. "All by yourself?" A shadow crossed his face. "Not always." Rose gently touched her daughter's arm. Abigail, perceptive beyond her years, immediately launched into a description of a kitten she'd once had, filling the silence. When they had finished, George collected the bowls. "There's a creek behind the barn," he said to Rose. "Water's clean if you want to wash." "Thank you," Rose said, looking up at him. "For everything." George shifted uncomfortably. "No need," he said gruffly. "Rest well." That night Rose lay awake. In the distance, coyotes called. Closer, she could hear the stamp of horses. Through a crack in the boards, she could see George sitting on the porch again, his silhouette outlined against the night. She wondered what ghost kept him company through these long night watches. He had the look of a man who carried his past like armor, protecting and imprisoning him all at once. Rose touched the hidden badge sewn into her dress hem, feeling its contours. Whatever George's secrets were, she had her own to keep, for now at least, until she could be certain of his intentions. With that thought, she finally surrendered to exhaustion. Morning came with the first tentative notes of birdsong. Rose woke feeling stronger. She stepped outside, breathing in the fresh morning air. The world held a different quality at this hour, a softness, a promise that disappeared as the day advanced. George emerged from the small room attached to the barn that served as his sleeping quarters. He nodded when he saw her, then returned moments later with the now familiar tin cup of warm milk and cornbread. "Morning," he said, offering them to her. "Thank you," Rose replied. "I was hoping I might help somehow today to repay your kindness." George considered this. "No need for repayment." "Please," Rose said. "I'm not used to sitting idle." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded once. "Chickens need feeding. Eggs need gathering. If you feel up to it." A sense of purpose washed through her. "I can manage that." George showed her where the feed was kept, then left her to the task. Rose worked slowly, finding comfort in the simple chore. Abigail joined her, delighted by the chickens and the discovery of warm eggs. Her childish wonder at these ordinary farm occurrences brought a genuine smile to Rose's face, the first in longer than she could remember. As the day progressed, Rose ventured further from the barn, taking stock of the ranch that had become their unexpected sanctuary. It was modest but well-maintained, bearing the marks of a solitary man's priorities. George worked steadily throughout the day, moving from one task to the next with quiet efficiency. Occasionally, Rose would catch him watching her and Abigail, his expression thoughtful before he turned back to his work. By midday, the heat had returned. Rose sent Abigail to rest, then attempted to fetch water from the well. The bucket was heavier than she expected, and halfway back her arms began to shake. Water sloshed over the sides. Suddenly, George was beside her. Without a word, he took the bucket from her hands. His fingers briefly brushed against hers in the exchange. He carried it the rest of the way to the barn, setting it down near the door. Rose followed, embarrassed by her weakness. "I'm sorry," she said. "I thought I could manage." "No harm done," George replied, already turning back to his work. "Mr. George," Abigail called from the barn doorway. "Is there a cat here? I heard something in the hay." George paused. "Barn cat had kittens last month. Probably one of them." Abigail's face lit up. "Can I see them?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Mother cat's friendly enough. They're up in the loft, far corner." As Abigail disappeared into the barn, Rose found herself alone with George for the first time. The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but weighted with unasked questions. Finally, Rose spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I want you to know we won't impose on you for long. As soon as I'm strong enough, we'll move on." George studied her. "Where will you go?" The question caught her off guard. She had been so focused on escaping that she hadn't thought beyond survival. "I don't know yet. Somewhere they won't find us." "The men who tied you to that rock," George said carefully. "Who were they?" Rose looked away. My husband's family, the Wades. Thomas, my husband, died 2 winters back. His family never forgave me that I didn't bear a son. Said I was bad luck. Said I cost them seed and legacy. George's expression darkened. Your husband's brother, Jeremiah? He's the eldest now, she confirmed. He let me stay in the house until spring, then moved us to the barn. And then yesterday, they said the Lord needed to judge me. Her voice was barely a whisper. That the river would speak on his behalf. George didn't respond verbally. He simply took his hat off and placed it on the ground beside him. It was a gesture from another time, one that acknowledged the gravity of her words without empty platitudes. They won't come looking, Rose added, trying to convince herself as much as him. They left me there to... She couldn't finish the sentence. To die, George said flatly. Rose nodded. Then they'll assume they succeeded, he concluded, unless someone saw me bring you here. The road was empty, Rose said. Abigail said she didn't see anyone when she ran for help. George nodded. Then you have time to decide what comes next. Why are you helping us? Rose asked suddenly. The question had been haunting her since the moment he cut her bonds. George was silent for so long, she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were simple but carried the weight of personal understanding. I know what it is to wait for help that doesn't come. Before Rose could respond, they heard Abigail's delighted laughter from inside the barn, followed by the tiny mewling of kittens. The moment of connection between them passed, but something had shifted. Some small barrier had lowered. George replaced his hat and nodded toward the barn. You should rest. Heat's worse this time of day. As he walked away, Rose watched his retreating figure, trying to reconcile the man's gruff exterior with the quiet compassion that had offered sanctuary without demands. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something other than fear and desperation. It wasn't hope, not quite, but perhaps it was the first tentative step toward it. Later that afternoon, Rose stepped out onto the porch where George was repairing a broken chair. I'm not weak, she said suddenly. George paused mid-motion, turned to look at her. Didn't say you were. They said I was useless, cursed, she continued. That's why my husband died. Why I couldn't bear again. Why the milk soured. George leaned against the porch post. You believe all that? He asked quietly. Sometimes, she admitted, squinting into the setting sun. When enough people say the same thing, it becomes hard not to hear it as truth. George regarded her steadily. I believe a lot of good things rot when folks speak fear with conviction. Rose looked away, surprised by how deeply his words resonated. There was a quiet wisdom in his observation, something that acknowledged the power of others' cruelty without accepting its validity. Your girl seems happy here, George observed. She adapts quickly, Rose said, a small smile touching her lips. Children do, I suppose. She paused, then added softly, she's had to. George nodded, understanding in his eyes. He returned to his work. The rhythmic sound of his hammer filled the air between them. That evening she cooked. Not much, just beans warmed over a small fire in the barn's corner hearth. Her hands, at first hesitant, remembered what it felt like to feed someone else. George came in after dusk, smelling of sweat and pine. He sat without question on a wooden crate. Abigail tucked herself between them, eyes bright with the day's adventures. I named him Copper, she informed George. Is that all right? Fine name for an orange cat, George agreed, accepting the bowl Rose offered him with a nod of thanks. They ate in comfortable silence. The simple meal tasted better than it had any right to. Later, as George stood to leave, Rose reached across the blanket and gently touched his wrist. Thank you for not asking anything of me. His eyes met hers, calm and steady. You already gave enough, he said softly. The simple statement acknowledged all she had endured without requiring her to explain further. Then he was gone, leaving Rose to wonder at how such a quiet man could speak words that resonated so deeply. She lay awake that night, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant howl of coyotes, the soft whickering of horses. Through the cracks in the barn wall, she could see George's silhouette on the porch again. What ghost did he converse with in the darkness? She thought of the badge hidden in her dress hem. Not yet, she thought, not until she was sure. The days passed with a rhythm of their own. Rose's strength returned gradually, her body healing. George maintained his quiet presence, neither imposing nor distant. He went about his daily work, but Rose began to notice small changes. Fresh milk and warm bread appeared by the barn door each morning. The path to the well was cleared of stones. A small wooden stool appeared near the chicken coop. One afternoon, Rose found a bundle outside the barn door. Clean fabric, scissors, needle, and thread. With careful hands, she stitched a new dress for herself. When George saw her wearing it the next day, he said nothing, but his eyes registered the change with quiet approval. A week into their stay, Rose ventured into the small vegetable garden behind the house. She knelt, testing the earth with her fingers. George found her there, gently loosening the soil around a row of struggling bean plants. "Garden could use a woman's touch," he observed. "Would you mind if I worked on it?" she asked. "I've always had luck with growing things." "It's yours if you want it," he replied. That evening, George left a small pouch near her quilt. Inside were flower seeds. "Wildflowers," he said, "from a part of the valley few visited." The next morning, she began clearing a small patch of earth near the barn, Abigail digging beside her. As she worked, she glanced up to find George watching from the corral. When their eyes met, he didn't look away, but gave a small nod before returning to his task. 2 weeks slipped by. Rose's body healed. The bruises faded. Her hair regained its sheen. The wildflower seeds she had planted pushed green shoots through the dry Montana soil, defiant in their determination to bloom. Abigail flourished. She followed George like a shadow when he allowed it. The orange kitten, Copper, became her constant companion. Then one morning, Rose noticed a wagon approaching on the distant road. It moved slowly, deliberately. She froze, clothespin in hand. A man and woman occupied the seat. They didn't wave. Their eyes lingered on Rose, recognition and judgment clear in their expressions. Rose stood motionless until the wagon disappeared. Rumors move faster than mail in these parts. Word of her presence at George's ranch had clearly reached town. That night, as darkness settled over the land, George sat by the barn door, sharpening a blade. "They ain't your judges," he said quietly without turning. Rose stepped into the lantern light, holding 2 mugs of chicory coffee. "They'll say I'm shaming your house," she said, offering him a mug. George accepted it. "A house ain't shamed by who it hold," he replied, "only by who it turns away." Rose almost cried, not from sorrow, but from the ache of being believed after so long. She sat beside him on the rough-hewn bench. "May I ask you something?" she ventured. George nodded. "You live here alone. Have you always?" He was quiet for so long. "There was a time I'd known love," he finally said, "and then there was a time after." He paused. "Her name was Sarah. She died in winter. Snow never felt the same since." Rose waited. He turned the conversation away from himself. "Your husband's people, the Wades, they have influence in these parts." "They have the ear of Pastor Phillips at the town church," Rose replied. "The kind of men who use God to justify cruelty." "They believe their own righteousness," George observed. "That's what makes them dangerous." They sat in silence, watching the stars. In this shared quiet, Rose felt a curious sense of peace. The next morning, she walked to the edge of the small apple orchard. Her dress, the one she had made from George's curtains, hung looser on her now. Her steps were steadier. She found herself glancing back toward the ranch house. She hadn't entered it yet. She wondered if that was kindness on his part or habit. She wondered if it mattered. As they turned back, Rose saw George on horseback approaching from the direction of town. He dismounted near the corral. His expression was grave. "Town's talking," he said without preamble. Rose nodded, unsurprised. "Pastor's been asking questions about you, about me, about why you're here." "What did you tell them?" Rose asked, anxiety tightening her chest. "Nothing. Wasn't there to hear them." He glanced down at Abigail. "Heard it from Miller at the feed store." Rose understood the unspoken warning. The town's gossip was the first stirring of trouble. "Perhaps we should move on," she said quietly. "No," George interrupted. The single word was firm and final. He looked at her directly. "This is your home for as long as you want it." Something in his tone made Rose's breath catch. There was a certainty in his voice she hadn't heard before. "I won't bring trouble to your door," she insisted. Trouble finds its own way, he replied. Has nothing to do with you. That evening, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Rose helped George secure the chicken coop and bring the calves into the barn. The air felt electric. As they finished, the first fat drops of rain began to fall. They retreated to the barn where Abigail was already curled up with Copper. Will it flood, Mr. George? She asked. Not here, he assured her. Your mama picked a good spot to plant those flowers. Rose smiled at his deliberate reassurance. As night fell, the storm intensified. Lightning flashed. George appeared at her side, offering a blanket. Storm like this cleanses the land, he observed. Or washes it away entirely, she countered. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You've seen your share of storms. Not all of them come from the sky, she replied softly. Those are often the worst kind, he agreed. A particularly bright flash of lightning illuminated the yard. Abigail cried out in alarm. It's just the sky talking, sweet girl, Rose soothed. Thunder is just the angels moving furniture. George raised an eyebrow at this explanation. He went to check on the horses, speaking low, reassuring words. When he returned, he found Abigail asleep. She trusts easily, George observed. Too easily sometimes, Rose agreed. She sees good in people before anything else. Rare gift, George said. Hope she keeps it. George settled on a hay bale opposite her. Your husband, he said carefully. Was he cruel to her as well? The question took Rose by surprise. Thomas ignored her mostly, she finally replied. He wanted a son. He acted as if she barely existed. In some ways, that was its own kind of cruelty. George nodded. My father was like that, preferred horses to children. At least horses could be trained to his liking. It was the first time he had shared anything of his own childhood. Rose asked if he had been close to his mother. She died young, he said simply. Fever took her when I was 9. I'm sorry, Rose said, the words feeling inadequate. Long time ago now. A comfortable silence fell between them. You dream of her? Rose asked suddenly. You're Sarah. George's expression shifted. Sometimes, and he admitted. What was she like? The question slipped out before Rose could stop it. For a moment, she thought she had overstepped. Then he spoke. Kind, he said. The single word weighted with memory. Laughed easy, saw beauty in ordinary things. Strong-willed, too. Had opinions about everything from politics to how a garden should be planted. Rose smiled. She sounds wonderful. She was. He paused, then asked, Your people before the Wades, what were they like? Simple folk, Rose replied. My father farmed near Helena before the drought took our land. Mother died bringing my younger brother into the world. He followed her a week later. Father did his best, but times were hard. When Thomas Wade offered for me, with the promise of a secure home, she trailed off. You were sold to settle debts, George concluded, no judgment in his voice. Traded, Rose corrected gently. I was 17. The rain had softened to a gentle patter. The air that drifted through the barn door felt clean and new. You should sleep, George said, rising from his seat. Morning comes early, rain or shine. Good night, George, she said softly. He paused at the door, looking back at her. Good night, Rose, he replied, his use of her name deliberate and significant. Morning dawned, clear and brilliant after the storm. The world transformed. Puddles dotted the yard, reflecting the cloudless sky. Rose stepped outside, breathing deeply. The wildflower patch showed new growth. George was already at work, repairing a section of roof on the chicken coop. He acknowledged her presence with a nod. Mama, Abigail called, can I help Mr. George fix the roof? You stay on the ground, Rose cautioned. Hand him nails. George glanced down from his perch. Good morning, Miss Abigail, he said. I could use an assistant. Rose smiled at the small conspiracy between them. There was something about seeing them together that tugged at Rose's heart. George treated Abigail with a gentle respect that Thomas had never shown. As the morning progressed, Rose noticed a change in the air. A watchfulness had settled over George. He worked as methodically as ever, but his eyes frequently scanned the road. After Abigail had tired of nail sorting, Rose approached George as he gathered his tools. You're expecting trouble, she said. A statement, not a question. George straightened, meeting her gaze directly. Pastor rides out on Thursdays to visit outlying farms. And you think he'll come here today? Yes. Because of me? Rose asked. Because he's a man who believes in managing other people's business, George corrected. You're just his latest excuse. Despite the reassurance, Rose felt the weight of impending judgment. What will you tell him when he asks why I'm here? George considered her question. That you needed help, and I gave it. Nothing more needs explaining. But they both knew it wasn't that simple. In small communities, unmarried men and women did not share living quarters without raising questions. I could make myself scarce when he arrives, Rose suggested. Take Abigail to the orchard. George shook his head. No hiding, he said firmly. Not in your own home. The words hung between them, significant in their implication. Your own home. Before she could respond, Abigail called from the barn. Come see what Copper can do. The moment passed. The pastor arrived shortly after midday. He came on horseback, dressed in black, a silver cross swinging from his neck. He surveyed the ranch with undisguised disapproval. George was mending a harness near the corral when the pastor approached. Cutter, the pastor replied, his tone clipped. I'm here to inquire about the woman Rose Wade and the child. It's been said they're residing here improperly. George leaned against the corral post, arms crossed. They're here because someone left them to die, and I don't take kindly to ghosts haunting my land, Pastor. The pastor's nostrils flared. The Lord desires order, Cutter. This arrangement is raising tongues in town. Let them wag, George replied evenly. I answer to my conscience, not gossip. Proper standing? George interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. Was it proper to tie a woman to a rock in the summer heat and leave her to die? Was it proper for her own kin by marriage to treat her worse than a stray dog? Before the pastor could respond, Rose stepped out of the barn. She wore the dress she had made from George's curtains. She did not hide. She did not tremble. Mrs. Wade, the pastor said finally, the formal address somehow sounding like an accusation. Pastor Phillips, she replied, her voice steadier than she had expected. The community is concerned about your welfare. I wasn't rescued, Pastor, Rose said firmly, finding strength in the simple truth. I was reclaimed from death, from shame, from lies. Mr. Cutter offered shelter when those who should have protected me instead sought to destroy me. The pastor regarded her with open skepticism. The Wades speak differently of the matter. I imagine they do, Rose replied, unable to entirely mask the bitterness in her tone. The pastor's attention returned to George. You intend to marry her then? The words hung in the air like judgment. George looked at Rose, and in that moment, he didn't flinch. He didn't speak either. The question hovered, unanswered. Rose's breath hitched for a moment. When she spoke, her words were measured and clear. When a man saves your life without claiming your soul, Pastor, that's worth more than a dozen wedding vows. Pastor Phillips grunted, clearly dissatisfied. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. If you love her, wed her or release her. He extended the paper toward George. George took it without comment. You best prepare, the pastor added. Her kin are coming by the week's end. The Lord's work will be done. With that cryptic warning, he rode off. Rose and George stood in silence, watching until the pastor disappeared. What did he give you? Rose asked, nodding toward George's pocket. George withdrew the paper. Notice from the town council, he said, expressing their concern about our living arrangement. Rose closed her eyes briefly, shame and anger warring within her. I've brought trouble to your door. No, George said firmly. Trouble was already here, waiting for an excuse. He refolded the paper. Don't concern yourself with it. But Rose could see the tightness around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. The pastor's visit had confirmed what they both suspected. The peace they had found was temporary. He said they're coming, she said quietly. The Wades. George nodded once, his expression grim. By week's end. What will we do? George's eyes met hers, steady and resolute. We'll be ready. That night, Rose braided Abigail's hair tight and laid out extra clothes in case they had to run. After Abigail had fallen asleep, Rose joined George on the porch. The air was heavy with the scent of coming rain, but the clouds hovered, dark and ominous. I've been thinking about running, she admitted. George stared out at the fields. I built this place with hands that buried the only family I had, he said finally, his voice rough. If you think I'm letting it become a hunting ground for men who hurt women and call it righteousness, you don't know me yet." Rose looked at him and saw not just the quiet, solitary rancher, but a man of deep conviction and unwavering resolve. "They'll paint me wicked," she whispered, voicing her deepest fear. "Say I seduced a lonely man with a broken heart." George gave a small, humorless smile. "If you were wicked, Rose, I'd be on my knees thanking God for sending me something that still knew how to live." Rose laughed, a quiet, startled sound. It was the first time she had laughed in weeks. The sound seemed to surprise George as well, and for a brief moment, his usual stoic expression softened. They sat in companionable silence, watching lightning flicker in the distant clouds. "Tomorrow," George said after a while, "I'll ride into town. There's a man there, another preacher named Otis Miller. He owes me a favor." Rose glanced at him, curious. "The kind that might help us prepare for whatever's coming. Do you ever regret taking us in?" she asked. George turned to look at her directly. "Not for a single moment." He said the words simply, but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Rose held his gaze, feeling something shift between them. In that moment, she knew with certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. The next day, George rode out early. He left Rose with instructions to keep Abigail close and to prepare for visitors. She spent the day in a state of nervous anticipation. The brief respite at George's ranch was coming to an end. As the sun began its descent, Rose heard the sound of hooves approaching. She tensed, but it was George, accompanied by a second rider, a lanky man with long gray hair. "Rose," George called. "This is Otis Miller, former preacher, current horse trader, and occasional voice of reason in unreasonable times." The man named Otis stepped forward, his grip firm. "George has told me some of your trouble," he said. "I'm sorry for what you've endured." There was no judgment in his eyes, only a compassionate understanding that immediately put Rose at ease. "I still hold credentials as an ordained minister," Otis said, turning back to Rose. "Though I left the formal church some years ago when their politics became more important than their principles. George thought I might be of service should you desire to formalize your situation here." Rose's breath caught. She looked at George, who was watching her with careful attention. "I see," she said carefully. "And have you come to perform this service immediately?" "Not unless you wish it," Otis replied easily. "I'm in no hurry. Thought I might stay the night, help George with that fence he's been neglecting, and we can see how things stand in the morning." Otis's easy humor lightened the moment. As they settled in for the evening, Abigail took an immediate liking to Otis, especially after he produced a small wooden whistle from his pocket and taught her how to play a simple tune. Later, after Abigail slept and Otis had retired, Rose and George found themselves alone on the porch once more. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast Montana sky. "You brought him here to marry us," Rose said directly. George nodded once. "If that's what you want." "Is it what you want, George?" He was silent for a long moment. "I want you safe," he finally said. "You and Abigail both. If marriage provides that safety, then yes." "But is that all?" Rose pressed, needing to understand his true feelings. George turned to face her fully. "No," he admitted, "that's not all." The simple acknowledgement hung between them, weighted with unspoken emotion. "I need to show you something," she said suddenly, reaching for the hem of her dress where the hidden pocket lay. "Before you decide anything, there's something you should know about me." Rose's fingers trembled as she withdrew the small object. The military badge gleamed dully in the faint light. "This belonged to my brother," she said quietly. "He fought for the South while you fought for the North." George's expression remained unreadable as he took the badge. "How did you know I fought?" he asked. "The way you stand sometimes, how you wake at the slightest sound, the scars on your hands, and there's a Union jacket folded in your trunk. I saw it when I was sweeping." George nodded slowly. "Your brother. Which regiment?" "He served under Colonel Jackson," Rose replied. "He died at Antietam." George went very still. "I was there," he said after a long silence. "We killed many men that day." "I know," Rose said softly, "and I don't blame you. War makes us into different people, but we don't have to stay those people forever." George studied the badge, then carefully returned it to her. Why did you keep this hidden? At first, I didn't trust you, Rose admitted. The Wades are still bitter about the war. They would have thrown me out if they'd known my brother fought for the South. Later, I just wasn't sure how you would feel about it. George shook his head. The war is long over, and we've all lost enough to it already. Relief washed through her. Does this change things? No, he said simply. Does it change anything? No, he replied. Not a single thing. The next day dawned, clear and bright. George was up before dawn checking fences. Otis helped with morning chores, his cheerful presence a welcome counterpoint to the day's underlying anxiety. Rose moved through familiar tasks with mechanical precision, her mind elsewhere. As midday approached, George approached her where she hung laundry. They'll come soon, he said without preamble, probably before sundown. What do you plan to do? Stand, he said simply. Make it clear they're not welcome unless they come in peace. And if they don't, then they'll learn what it means to threaten what's mine. The possessive claim sent an unexpected warmth through Rose. I don't want bloodshed on my account, she said firmly. Nor do I, George agreed. But I won't let them harm you or Abigail, Rose. Some lines can't be crossed. Before she could respond, Otis called from near the house. Riders coming, 4 of them by the dust. The moment had arrived. Rose felt a surge of fear, quickly followed by a steely resolve. She would not cower. Abby, she called to her daughter, come here, please, right now. Abigail ran to her side, her face serious. Remember what we talked about? If things get frightening, you go straight to the root cellar behind the house and stay there until one of us comes for you. Abigail nodded. George stepped forward, positioning himself between the approaching men and Rose. Otis moved to stand nearby. 4 men rode into the yard. At their head was Jeremiah Wade, Rose's brother-in-law, his face bitter and flushed. She's coming with us, he spat, pointing at Rose. Her and the brat. Wade blood don't get raised under bastard roofs. George didn't move. You tied her to a rock and left her for the sun, he replied, his voice dry as gravel. I figure you gave up your right to speak about family. Jeremiah's face darkened. She's a liar, a barren witch. One of the men behind Jeremiah reached for his pistol. George raised his rifle slightly. You'll walk away now, George said, calm but unshakable. You'll ride out and forget she ever knew you. And if we don't? Jeremiah asked. George's eyes held something terrible and beautiful in their depths. Then I won't bury what's left of you. A tense silence. Wind whistled. A cloud passed before the sun. And then Abigail darted forward, breaking free of Rose's grasp. Before anyone could stop her, she positioned herself between George and the men, her small frame vibrating with protective fury. Don't hurt my papa, she cried. The unexpected words fell like stones into the tense silence. Everyone froze. George looked at Rose, confusion in his eyes. Jeremiah's bitter expression transformed into one of malicious delight. Well, well, he drawled. Seems the girl's been told some pretty tales. Abby, come back here now, Rose called, her voice tight with fear. But Abigail stood her ground. You're bad men, she declared with a child's forthright conviction. You hurt my mama, and now you want to hurt my papa. Your papa, Jeremiah repeated with mocking emphasis. Is that what they've told you, girl? Enough, George said, his voice cutting through the tension. He moved forward, placing a protective hand on Abigail's shoulder. The child has nothing to do with this. Oh, but she does, Jeremiah countered, especially if she's being raised on lies. This isn't over, Jeremiah said, finally backing toward his horse. The law's on our side. She's a Wade by marriage. The law recognizes new marriages as well, Otis commented mildly. Should one occur. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed as he looked between George and Rose. So that's your game? Pastor Phillips won't marry you. He knows what she is. Good thing I don't need Pastor Phillips then, Otis replied with a ghost of a smile. Uncertainty showed in Jeremiah's expression. He mounted his horse. You've made an enemy today, Cutter. Wouldn't be the first time, George replied. Without another word, Jeremiah wheeled his horse around and rode off. Only when they had disappeared did George relax. He looked down at Abigail. That was brave, he said quietly, but dangerous. Your mama was frightened for you. I'm sorry, Mama, Abigail murmured against Rose's shoulder. But I couldn't let them hurt Mr. George. He takes care of us. Rose met George's eyes over her daughter's head. Yes, she agreed softly. He does. Otis cleared his throat discreetly. I believe I'll check on the horses. He moved off, giving them privacy. She called you Papa, Rose said, addressing the elephant that had just entered their relationship. George nodded, his expression thoughtful. Children need anchors, he said simply, especially in storms. Rose studied his face. Does it bother you, her thinking of you that way? George considered the question. No, he said finally. It honors me. The Wades will be back, she said, or they'll find another way to cause trouble. Yes, George agreed, though Otis gave them something to think about with that talk of marriage. Rose felt her cheeks warm. Yes, he did. A moment of silence stretched between them. I should check on Abigail, Rose said finally. I'll help Otis with the horses. As they parted, Rose felt the phantom sensation of words unsaid hovering between them, a conversation postponed, but increasingly inevitable. That evening, after a simple supper in George's kitchen, Otis entertained them with stories. When Abigail had gone to bed, Rose returned to find George and Otis in serious conversation on the porch. Fine night, Otis observed. My business here isn't finished unless you say it is. The implication was clear. Rose glanced at George. I think, George said carefully, that's a conversation for Rose and me to have privately. Otis nodded, rising from his seat. Then I'll bid you both good night. After he had gone, silence settled between them. What Abigail said today, Rose began hesitantly. We don't need to make decisions based on a child's words, George interrupted gently. Sometimes they see truth before we're ready to acknowledge it, Rose countered, gathering her courage. The Wades will come back, George. As long as I'm a widow with no protection, they'll believe they have a claim. George nodded. Marriage would solve that problem. Rose continued, her voice steady. It would give Abigail a father in the eyes of the law, and me a husband whose authority would supersede my brother-in-law's claims? Yes, George agreed. It would do those things. Rose studied his face, frustrated by his inscrutability. But is that all it would be? A legal arrangement for protection? George was silent for a long moment. No, he said simply. Not for me. The admission hung in the air, honest in its simplicity. Not for me either, Rose whispered. George turned to face her fully, his expression completely unguarded. I've been alone a long time, he said quietly. Thought I'd always be. Then you and Abigail came, and suddenly this place felt like a home again. Not just somewhere I exist. Rose nodded. I forgot what it felt like to be seen as a person. You gave that back to me, George. He reached out slowly and took her hand in his. I'm not a man of many words, he said, but I want you to stay, Rose. Not just for safety or convenience, but because you make the world feel right again. It wasn't a traditional declaration of love, but to Rose it was more meaningful than any poetic speech. I want to stay, she replied, not just because it's safe here, but because for the first time in years, I feel like myself again when I'm with you. George's hand tightened around hers. So, Rose said finally, a small smile touching her lips. Should we tell Otis he has work to do tomorrow? George's answering smile was rare and transformative. I think we should, he agreed. That night Rose slept better than she had in years. Morning came with the first tentative notes of birdsong. Rose woke to find Abigail already up, playing with Copper. In the kitchen she found Otis presiding over a skillet of eggs and bacon. George mentioned you might have news for me this morning, he said, his eyes twinkling. Yes, Rose confirmed. If you are still willing, we'd be grateful for your services today. Otis nodded. I thought as much. Been carrying a marriage certificate in my saddlebag for years, waiting for the right occasion. Seems today's the day. After breakfast, Rose walked with Abigail to the small apple orchard. Mama, Abigail said, tugging at her hand, is Mr. George going to be my papa for real now? Would you like that, Abby? Yes, Abigail nodded vigorously. He's kind to us, and he makes you smile. Papa never made you smile. The simple observation brought tears to Rose's eyes. Then he should be my papa, Abigail declared, and we should stay here forever. That's what we're planning to do, Rose said. Throughout the day, a quiet anticipation built around the ranch. George disappeared for several hours, returning with his horse lathered. He offered no explanation, but when he emerged from the house later, he was wearing a clean shirt. As the sun began its descent, bathing the land in golden light, George approached Rose near her wildflower patch. I've been thinking, he said without preamble, about where to do this. The house would be traditional, she suggested. George shook his head. I had somewhere else in mind, if you're willing. Where? She asked. The river rock, he said quietly. Where I found you. Rose's breath caught. Where you were left, he explained softly. And if it's all right by you, I want it to be where something new begins. The significance of his choice struck her with unexpected force. The place of her greatest humiliation, transformed into a site of new beginnings. It's perfect, she assured him, deeply moved. Good, he said simply. Otis is ready whenever we are. As the golden light settled over the land, a small procession made its way toward the river. When they reached the river bend, Rose was surprised to see the transformation. The rock, once a symbol of her suffering, had been adorned with wildflowers, their colors vivid against the weathered gray. George, she breathed, when did you do this? This morning, he replied, a hint of uncertainty in his tone. Is it all right? It's perfect, she assured him. Otis cleared his throat. I'd rather do this before the sun fully sets. My eyes don't take kindly to twilight. George smiled, a rare, genuine expression. Rose laughed. Abigail placed Copper down beside the stone and held both their hands. We're gathered here, Otis began, his voice carrying in the still evening air. Not in a grand church, but in God's own cathedral. We come to witness two souls who've seen darkness, choose light instead. His simple eloquence brought tears to her eyes. This was real, honest, and unadorned, like George himself. When it came time for their vows, George turned to face Rose fully. I take you as you are, he said simply, with your past and your hopes. I promise to stand beside you, to protect what we build together, and to remember always that strength isn't in silence, but in how we carry each other's burdens. When her turn came, Rose's voice was clear. I choose you freely, she said, holding his gaze. After knowing captivity, that choice means everything. I promise to build with you, to trust in your steadiness, and to help make this house we share into a true home filled with warmth and honesty. Otis nodded. I pronounce you husband and wife in the eyes of God and any who care to acknowledge it. He looked at George with a twinkle in his eye. You may kiss your bride. The kiss was brief but tender, a promise of companionship. Abigail clapped delightedly. We're a family now, she exclaimed. There were no rings, but George pressed a coin into Rose's palm, warm from his pocket. It's from my mother's keepsake box, he explained, the only thing she left behind. Rose closed her hand around it. Then I'll keep it close, she promised. That night, the ranch hummed with new energy. Lanterns glowed in every window of the house that was now truly their shared home. Rose's first pie in years cooled on the windowsill. George sat on the porch, Rose beside him, their hands brushing gently in the darkness. The land, once scorched by cruelty, felt like it was learning how to bloom again. What happens now? Rose asked softly. We build, he said simply, day by day, season by season. Abigail appeared in the doorway, sleepy but reluctant to end such a special day. Mama, Papa, she called. Rose looked to George, curious how he would respond to this first use of the name. His expression softened. Come here, little one, he said, opening his arms. Abigail ran to them, climbing into George's lap without hesitation. Tell me a story, Papa, she requested through a yawn. George looked momentarily panicked, but then began. Once there was a house that stood alone for a very long time. It was a good house, but it was quiet. Too quiet. Then one day a small family came to the house. They brought laughter and songs and even flowers to plant in the yard. And the house, which had been just a building before, began to remember what it was like to be a home. Abigail's eyes drooped as she listened. Did they live happily ever after? She murmured. George looked at Rose, something vulnerable and hopeful in his expression. They lived truthfully ever after, he answered carefully, which isn't always happy, but is better in the long run. Rose reached over to take his hand, entwining her fingers with his, in silent agreement. As Abigail drifted to sleep in George's arms, Rose felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. The past had prepared them to recognize and appreciate the peace they had found together. The night stretched around them, vast and full of stars. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had created something precious and rare. A family built not on obligation or convention, but on choice, respect, and the quiet courage to begin again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon for more real-life narratives of resilience and hope.